cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. And that becomes the foundation of what he claims to be true. Well, see, I'm not a cogito guy. As a Catholic, I'm more cogitamus, that we think, that we think together. So you're right. I might have gone through this illative process of my own arguments and intuitions, hunches, experiences. But then the beautiful thing is I talk to you about it. And what do you think about this? And I throw it to you like two tennis players, and I hit the ball to you with my own spin on it, but then you hit it back to me. And then we send it to somebody else. And then we even, like Chesterton said, like the democracy of the dead, is that we let the dead have a vote. So now I talk to Aristotle about it, and I talk to Thomas Aquinas about it. And in that process of the cogitamus across space and time, I come to a surer grasp of the truth. So I think I like the instinct again behind that question, because it's rarely the individual that knows. It's the cogitamus more than the cogito.
That's great. You use the analogy sometimes of coming to know a person, and you say it's a similar. Can you walk us through that?
I think, I imagine most of us here in this room are people of faith, and I think it's the best analogy. When I'm talking to people who are really rationalistic, they're very naturalistic, scientistic even. What is faith? What do you mean by faith? I always make the distinction. Faith is not the darkness prior to reason. It's the darkness on the far side of reason. The darkness prior to reason, that's just superstition. That's credulity. That's naivete, I'm against all of that. And I think the church classically is against all of that. And we don't want to confuse that sort of infra-rational superstition with faith. Faith, as I say, is on the far side of the light of reason. And then the example of knowing a person, I think, is really illuminating, because when you come to know somebody, your reason plays a role, obviously. You look at the person, you assess that person, you probably Google that person and find out what you can. You use your mind to uncover a lot of facts. Then you might come to know the person directly, and by conversation and so on, you come to know them even better. But there will come a point, and anyone in this room has ever fallen in love, notice the language, falling in love. That doesn't mean I'm in control of the situation, right? There comes a point where that person's going to say something to you that you would never have known from a Google search. You'd never have known from just your own observations. You'd never know from casual conversation. You only know because she has decided to open her heart to you. And at that point, you got to make a decision, right? Anyone that's become a great friend to someone else, you have to decide, now, do I believe that or not? And let's say the person is saying something just crazy that's totally out of step with everything else you know. Well, you might say, no, I don't believe that. That's not trustworthy. But if you've come to trust the person, you've come to love the person, and they say something that's not out of step with reason, but it's not something you'd access any other way. And then you say, yeah, I believe that because I love you and I trust you. I think that's the best analogy for faith, let's say, in the biblical revelation. So, I'll say as a Catholic, there's a lot that reason can tell us about God. I'm happy to use philosophy all that I can, science, mathematics, to understand truths about God. But at a key moment, we claim, God also spoke. Do I believe him or not? Right? Now, that's faith. That's faith. When I say, yeah, I believe, I accept, because I've come to know and trust the person who speaks. I think that's the best analogy for the faith-reason relationship.
Nice.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's fantastic. I think I want to talk a little bit about some of your evangelistic work through new media, and just want to start kind of low on the ground. You spent all this time, one of the things I love, you spent all this time engaging in the comments on YouTube, which first says something about the thickness of your skin and your patience. But what have you learned? Whether it's about how to evangelize wisely using new media, maybe it's about the state of the hearts and minds of the people who are watching your videos. What have you learned?
No, I appreciate that. And I do it much less than I used to. So when I first got started, I started doing YouTube videos. I don't know if anyone's watched any of these videos, but in the year 2007, and YouTube was invented in 2006. So it had just come into being at that point. And all I knew was that YouTube was like a video of, here's my cat jumping off the roof. It was like just silly stuff. But a friend of mine said, we could try something on YouTube. How about you do commentaries on movies or music or what's going on in the world? And I said, oh, okay, I guess we could try it. And we had a donation at the time. Someone had given us some money and said, do something creative with this. So we used it to start the YouTube thing. And in the early days, I remember vividly when this friend of mine, Father Steve, who really runs Word on Fire, called me up excitedly. We got 300 people watch the video. And I'm like, no kidding, 300 people watched our stupid video? So
but for an academic, 300 people looking at your stuff is a miracle.
Right.
I mean, this is like.
So I was thrilled at that point, So to get things rolling in the early days, I discovered that is the two main things you need is freshness, novelty. You have to keep putting things out, and then interaction. So in the early days, I'd spend time going over the comments and responding. As you suggest, there's something very kind of dark and negative about that world. There is, because people are just nasty to each other. That's one of the dark sides of social media. On the other hand, what I loved about it is people would come on and they hated God, they hated the church, they hated me, like roughly in that order. but okay, they made some kind of argument. They said, I don't agree with this. I got some traction. Yeah. I say, okay, it sounds to me like you're not happy with whatever. And let me try to answer that. So even those obnoxious early responses gave me a little traction, a little toehold, right, in that person's world. And then what happened is sometimes these great conversations would start to unfold as okay, he's listening to me. Okay, the guy responded to me, so they would, come back. Hardly anyone on the internet ever says, that's a really good point. I agree with you. I mean, so everyone's got to have the last word, right. But you find out, because people would tell me later, I know I was pretty obnoxious to you on YouTube, but, that really did have an impact on me. Or someone will say, you never knew they existed, but, I watched that thread that you had with that guy, the back and forth, and that really impacted me. So in the early days, I did it much more. Now I can't. I mean, occasionally I'll jump on and respond, but in the early days I did. And it did give me a sense of evangelical confidence, okay. Because here people, let's face it, would never darken the door of one of our churches. Yeah. 99% of people who come online, they're not going to come to our programs. Here's a program on faith and reason. They're not going to come to that. Yeah. But I do a commentary on some film that everyone's talking about, and hey, there's this priest talking about that movie. I'll watch that. So I like that about it. I think that's a gift. I said this, in fact, in Rome. I was a delegate to the Synod on Youth. It was back in 2018, which was a month-long gathering of bishops with Pope Francis. He was there every day to talk about young people and how to reach them. And I said, we are going through a crisis of disaffiliation. We all know that. A lot of people leaving our churches. I said, but isn't it interesting how precisely at this moment we've been given this gift of the social media? We're people that would never come to our churches, but yet I can move into their world to some degree. And so those early days when, hey, with 300, we've now, your president was a little bit behind, we're almost at 100 million views on YouTube. Well, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, if you had told me that back in 2007, I'd never believed it. But it shows you there's an interest. And if the churches present themselves in this public forum, I think we'll get a response.
Yeah. I want to come back in a second to the unaffiliated and the disaffiliated.
Yeah.
I want to pick up on the spiritual formation required for someone to wade into the comments. So I think about this, for evangelists in a polarized age, in an angry age. I go into social media with a little bit I have left, and I still sort of brace myself.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's a spiritual sort of victory when I just don't wade in at all. So can you talk about just how someone can be formed in such a way to be able to do that with grace and strength and confidence? And
yeah, I'll say a couple things. It's a good question. I do a holy hour every day. So I wake up in the morning, I get a cup of coffee, and I go to my chapel in my house. I have the privilege of having the Blessed Sacrament in my house. And spend the first hour of the day in prayer. So that's just the way I get myself focused, right, for the day. And I always make a point of praying for anyone that is going to use my social media today. And it's just a way of, God doesn't need to be reminded, but it reminds me that I'm dealing with people and not just words and abstractions. There are real people behind even the meanest words. And, in God's providence, they've come. And maybe with bad motives, maybe, they do hate me or they hate the church, but by God, and I mean that literally, by God, they've come. And so, Lord, I pray for all these people and give me the grace to engage them well. So part of it really is steady formation in prayer. Otherwise, we will turn into sputtering. Well, how could you say that? I'm going to tell you. And especially if you have some theological training, and someone makes let's face it, kind of a stupid remark, and they go, well, Thomas Aquinas points out. Well, what does that accomplish? It maybe makes me feel good for a second, but it doesn't help that person. So one thing I've done, I still do it, and it's for my benefit really, but I almost invariably, when I'm responding to someone, I'll say, friend, comma, and then I'll make the response. And it's to signal to me, okay, even if this person is super obnoxious, I'm here for this person. They're someone that can be evangelized, and so I call them friend on purpose. The other thing I would say is, and a lot of people ask me, especially in my Catholic world, like, what do I do if I want to do that work too? I want to get in that. I said, begin with the old technology of books and read and read and read and read and read. So you've got something to say to people that's worthwhile. The problem is, hey, I like social media. Hey, I'm pretty good at that. I'm going to get involved. Yeah, but you're not ready. You're not ready to respond to these questions. You're not ready to give a properly nuanced answer. So I'd say spiritual preparation and intellectual preparation are really important. I've told my brother bishops, bishops will send students for like doctorates. So I was sent years ago to get a doctorate to teach in the seminary, which is great. But I said, I think you should get your best and brightest people, young priests, send them for a doctorate, high level, to do social media. And then put them in charge of social media for your diocese. And then do what I've done. Say, I'm going to just ask me anything. I'll talk about a movie, talk about music, talk about the culture. Hey, call me with a question. But have someone that's really well trained to be able to do that. Yeah. So those two things I would say.
That's great. And it occurs to me too, years in the classroom for you, that's got to have played a significant role there.
Yeah. I mean, so for 20 years I taught theology, and you hear all the questions basically. Yeah. They're really, in a way, there aren't that many questions. They're the classic ones that Augustine entertained, that Aquinas entertained, that the author of Job entertains. I mean, the standard questions are still pretty much the ones that come up.
Yeah. And it strikes me, I've been reading a bunch of Bishop Barron's work too, that you've got maybe 20 really significant kind of moves you make. I see you make them again and again. And so also for would-be evangelists, it strikes me that you need to find those pieces that you can deploy effectively.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you, I'm a great admirer of Billy Graham, and I actually saw him one time toward the end of his life. He was preaching in Cincinnati. It's a long story, and I was there and heard him. And he was an old master. That's what struck me. This guy is a master, But listen to Billy Graham homilies all over the world. They have the same structure, right? Yeah. And they have this basic evangelical structure, which is, you've tried this, and that to be happy, haven't you? And it hasn't worked. Well, I have what will make you happy. I mean, so they're variegated, and they're different audiences, but there's a basic evangelical structure, and they culminated in the altar call, right, that we had tonight. But I think there's a lot of wisdom to that when you have a basic structure to the outreach. That helps.
So just to test it, if I say the problem of science and religion, where are the 2 or 3 places you're going to go with people?
Well, I'm going to go first to speak against scientism, right? That I love science, and the Catholic tradition certainly reverences the sciences. The formulator of the Big Bang Theory is a Catholic priest. Most people don't know that. Georges Lemaitre. Mendel, Catholic friar, the discoverer of genetics, et cetera, et cetera. So we love the sciences, but we don't like scientism, which is the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. So the scientific method is great when it comes to analyzing the empirical world of nature. Fine. But don't tell me that Hamlet's not giving me anything true, or that Plato's Symposium is not teaching me something true, right? So don't reduce knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. Religion. David Tracy says religion is a close cousin of things like poetry and philosophy. And so once you've opened the path to say, there are non-scientific ways of knowing, well, then I open the door to religion as a way of knowing. So that's the way I would start to look at like a religion science issue.
I noticed you pick up something from Ratzinger too, his Introduction to Christianity. There are two propositions about the emergence of science from the Christian faith too.
Right, which I think it's very important for, again, I'm presuming most of us are Christians in the room. The sciences, in a very important sense, came from religion. The myth, and it is a myth, of the hostility of religion and science. All the great early scientists, they're all trained in church-sponsored universities, which is where they learn their mathematics and their astronomy and so on, their basic, physics. But more importantly, it's these two theological ideas, really growing out of the idea of creation. Namely, that the world is not God. It's very important because if you think the world is God, and a lot of people do, look at a lot of the New Age today, but whether it's forms of paganism or animism or different types of nature religion, that nature is divinized. Well, if nature is divinized, you'll worship it, but you're not going to experiment on it or cut it up and analyze it. And so, but if the world isn't God, the world isn't divine, well then, I can experiment and so on. The second assumption is that everything in the world is imbued with intelligibility. That's the Ratzinger idea. And that's the assumption, and I don't know any word for it except mystical, because it's not itself a scientific conclusion, it's an assumption. All the sciences have to assume that the world is intelligible. But that's a weird thing the more you think about it. We take it so for granted. Well, of course the world's intelligible. So I'm a physicist, chemist, biologist, psychologist. I'm going to go out to meet a world that's marked by patterned intelligibility. Well, yeah, but why should that be the case? Why should that be the case? Unless there's someone like an intelligence behind the intelligibility of the world. So when those two things come together, the world isn't God, but the world is fully imbued with intelligibility. Now the sciences get off the ground. And so it's no accident they come up out of a Christian milieu, And I think that's something that even a lot of Christians don't understand.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, I wanted to bring up the Ratzinger for you all, because when I hear someone like Bishop Barron, I'm amazed and intimidated, and I think, well, that's not something I can do. This feels like an inimitable thing. He's a special person with a special intellect and a special gift for communication. But I wanted to bring it up because notice he said, what you do if you want to be an apologist, an evangelist, you read. He read, this book is read all across the world, An Introduction to Christianity by a man who became the Pope, and he noticed in there a really key point. And he brought it out, and he continues to make, so just notice that this very gifted man, you also don't have to be a genius. You can actually read and pick up on things, file them away, and then deploy them at the right time, which I've been blessed again by that in your work. Why do people leave the church?
Well, I actually do know this one. Because happily they tell us, and we don't have to guess.
Yeah.
I find, though, with the question of disaffiliation, everyone's got an opinion. Trust me, is whenever you speak about this, everyone's got an opinion of why people leave. What I like to do, though, is look at the surveys. There have been tons of surveys that ask precisely that question, especially the young people. Why have you left? You know what? The big reason, and again, in survey after survey, I don't believe the doctrines. There's an intellectual problem. Young people will say, I never got my questions answered. It doesn't make sense to me. And then closely related, a second reason, science refutes religion. Science and religion are opposed. Science is obviously good and correct. Therefore, religion is silly, and we should get rid of it. The third reason I would say is, it's born of our commitment to relativism, is how could anyone claim that their religion is right? There's 1,000 different religions and philosophies, and how could you possibly say that yours is right? I'd say a fourth major reason would be scandals. Now I'm speaking as a Catholic out of painful experience of the scandals in our own church. That has had an impact. for sure, on young people. But I'm always struck by how the intellectual issues are often at the forefront. Young people are balking what they take to be either the irrelevance, the stupidity, the superstitious nature, the non-scientific nature of religion. But those are some of the reasons they classically give.
Do you ever wonder if the intellectual reasons are smoke screens or sort of a kind of a more acceptable excuse for something that might be more idiosyncratic?
Could be. I mean, it could be, though. I'm kind of resistant to that, and that has certainly been argued. Because I don't want to diminish that. I think it's very important that we engage people at that level, and I think we should believe them unless we have really compelling reason to think otherwise. Having said that, again, I'll quote Billy Graham, that most resistance to God, he said, is not intellectual, it's moral. And I do think there's a lot to that. Namely, if I believe in God, that's not like saying, oh, I accept a particular scientific theory, or I think that reading of Caravaggio is correct. I mean those aren't going to make that big a difference in my life. But if I say God exists, that means there's an absolute objective moral criterion, and that I've got to bring my life online with this reality. Well, there's a lot of us sinners that don't like that, right? Now, once you get past that sort of superficial resistance, you see how splendid it is to believe in God. But for a lot of people, it's a real obstacle, because if Jesus is Lord, I'm not the Lord. If he's the criterion of my life, my own will is not the criterion. And so it does cost me to believe in God. You know, I find the old Feuerbach argument, that religion is wishful thinking. Ludwig Feuerbach, the father of modern atheism, that religion is, it's an idealized self-understanding. So wouldn't it be great? I'd love to be all-knowing. I'd love to be all-powerful. I'd love to be all benevolent. So I project this image outward and I imagine that it exists, and that's God, right? It's wishful thinking. Freud picked up on that. Religion is like a waking dream. It's a wish-fulfilling fantasy, right? Read The New Atheists. Nothing new about them except they're kind of nastier, but they rehearsed all those old arguments. Yeah. But see, I always wonder, don't they ever ask, but atheism is also, I think, a wish-fulfilling fantasy, or could be construed that way. Wouldn't it be great if there's no God? Then I'm God. Wouldn't it be great if there's no moral criterion? I could do whatever I want. I wouldn't have to feel guilty. And so, sure, I think on both sides, people might be engaging in that wish-fulfilling fantasy. So why don't we just say, they cancel each other out, and let's return to real arguments.
Yeah, that's
how I think about that one.
There's also seems to be a plausibility crisis, and for 1,000 reasons. Globalization, we got neighbors who don't look like us, don't believe like us. There's the scandals you talked about. There's the kind of erosion of robust belief. But I think about how many people I've talked to who said something like, the church hurt me.
Yeah.
And I wonder about that sometimes. I wonder there about, is that a fully told truth? But it's certainly sincerely believed by many. How do you minister to people who tell that story?
Yeah, and I do hear that story, and that does come up in the surveys too. And it could be the simplest thing, like I called the parish and I got a rude response. Or here's one that kind of breaks my heart, that people say, I left the Catholic Church, I stopped going to Mass, and no one noticed. Like, no one called me, no one from the church, hey, where are you? None of my neighbors said, hey, I haven't seen you at Mass for a couple of weeks, are you okay? So yeah, our own indifference to each other, even cruelty to each other, doesn't help. Go back to Tertullian's famous line, what convinced so many in the early church? How these Christians love one another. That's what got them. It wasn't the doctrines right away. It was, look how they treat each other. And we talk about the internet stuff, the social media. I've scolded my fellow Catholics publicly on this, because occasionally, and not just on my site, a lot of other ones, the battles that go on are so stupid and intense. And I'm saying, left and right. And I'll tell you a story. See what I'm doing right now. This is called the pectoral cross, right? And bishops wear it. I have it out now, which should make some people happy, because what we usually do is we tuck it in here, just because when you're walking around, it starts, trust me, if you wore one of these, you know why we put it in there. Well, I'm not joking. The number of times, if I'm on a video or something and I'm like this, why are you hiding the cross? What, you're ashamed? You're ashamed of the cross? I'm like, yeah, I've been a priest for 36 years because I'm ashamed of the cross, Well, the other day, I'm not making this up. The other day, it was my Easter homily. They used a thumbnail. It was a picture of me saying Mass, and I'm wearing a chasuble, which is the big, vestment on the outside of the alb. And some bishops wear the pectoral cross inside the chasuble, so you can't see it. Others, like myself, wear it outside. I got a 4-paragraph excoriating criticism of wearing the pectoral cross on the outside of my chasuble. Goodness. And I've always found, Bishop, that bishops that do this, have a deeper underlying psychological problem. Well, I thought, okay, this guy decided the best way to spend my morning is by writing 4 nasty paragraphs. Now, here's the point I'm making, because I'm used to this crazy stuff. But imagine someone now who is a sincere seeker after the Lord, and they, hey, this Bishop Barron, I hear he's a Catholic. Let me go on his website and find out what he's saying. And maybe they start listening to the homily, but then they're reading the comments, and they come across this guy who's obsessed with where you wear the pectoral cross. The way we disedify people by our own stupidity and nastiness to each other. So one of the best things we could do, I think, in ordinary social intercourse and on the web, is let's be nice to each other. We Christians, should be pleasant to each other and friendly. That has enormous evangelical import. Yeah. And so you're right, that our own nastiness can turn people away. I know it does.
Let me ask one more follow-up on people hurt by the church, and I'd be more comfortable if you tucked it in.
Yeah, I know. I am ashamed of the cross of Jesus, which is why I've been a priest for 36 years.
Oh, man. And this isn't pulling out Catholic dirty laundry, because evangelicals have a lot of the same dirty laundry these days.
Yeah.
But going back to scandal, I texted my favorite lapsed Catholic today, one of my oldest friends, and I said, what would you ask the bishop? You're coming at this from he's Catholic, I'm a Protestant, he's lapsed. And we have good, frank conversations, and I just love him dearly. And he just went straight to the sexual abuse scandal and just, why hasn't the church done more? And so I don't so much want to know why hasn't the church done more, but can you talk about how I just read your letter to a suffering church, but how you responded to that?
Yeah, it's been god-awful. When I was ordained, 1986, it was not on the radar screen at all. I'm a Catholic insider, born and raised in Catholic, brought up through Catholic institutions. And may I say, like the vast majority of Catholics, never had the slightest difficulty with any priest. No one ever abused me in any way. And that's true for the overwhelming majority of Catholics, so that's important to say. But this issue of clergy sex abuse was not on the radar at all. It was in the early 90s in Chicago that it came on. And it's like a cloud. It's been like a cloud over my whole priesthood, practically. I mean, almost all the years I've been a priest, there's been this scandal. And I called it, in that book you referred to, the devil's masterpiece, because the devil, there's a story I've told before. It's a true story. I'm at this conference, and I'm wandering around the area where the books are, and I forget why, but I was the only one there. And there's this lady behind the counter at this publisher, and she goes, "Oh, you're Father Barron, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, I like what you're doing. And she said, the devil is very unhappy with you. And I said, well, I hope so.
I don't like him much either. So.
But then she said, and it's still in my heart, she said, well, he's a lot smarter than you are, and he's a lot more powerful than you are. Wow. And I said, yeah, I know. But he is. And the clergy sex abuse scandal is a masterpiece of wickedness, because there's the original wickedness of the abuse of young people, but look at the myriad ways it's undermined the church. In almost every way, it's undermined the work of the church. And so, your friend, and like many others, I'm gone because of that. Well, the devil is delighted with that. So it's been a nightmare. It's been like this dark cloud. It's been a demonic masterpiece, I would say. The church has responded, and that's important to point out. It has. The Dallas Accords 2002 became a model for a lot of institutions as they responded to this problem. And it's also fair to say, since those accords, the numbers have fallen off the table. So there was a great increase in this thing from the 60s through the early 80s. And that's been well documented, that's where the numbers really climbed. They fell off the table. And so it has come much more under control. One abused kid is way, way, way too many. Absolutely true. But progress has been made, I think, institutionally. And God knows we paid, I mean, quite literally, the church has paid out hundreds and hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. Money that could go to the poor and could go to catechesis and education and evangelization. Again, part of the devil's masterpiece, I think. So, it's been a horrific nightmare for the church.
And one thing, partly what I wanted to ask, I was so struck by your biblical work, going through Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and his daughters, a number of places, and your work just sort of airing some of the ugliest moments in the history of the church, because it was non-defensive. It sort of looked the issue straight in the eye, but also kind of panned back to show the wider context. Because I think whenever there's horrific suffering, we have this experience that it's the sort of thing that has no analogy, and therefore it's the sort of thing, it's the one thing that we can never come to the other side of. And I found it really powerful the way that you didn't diminish it at all, but also saw it in the course of history as something that sadly has happened too often.
Yeah, something we said at dinner, how the Bible just provides the template for all of life. I mentioned I'm with Karl Barth. The purpose of preaching is really to draw our experience into the Bible, not the other way around. Like, experience shouldn't become the measure of the Bible, but the other way around. And on this issue, the Bible is so good. It's so clear. It's so clear-eyed about human depravity. And one form of that, of course, is sexual abuse. And the cases you mentioned. And then look at David and Bathsheba, David, the sweet singer of the house of Israel, the great King David. And then we watch him on the roof of his palace, not listening to God as the young David did, right? That was David's spiritual genius, was even the simplest things. He asked God, what do I do? And followed the will of God. But how beautifully told that chapter of 2 Samuel is, because he's up on the roof of his palace, not listening to God, but acting like God, surveying the whole thing. And then the Hebrew, he has him barking these orders. He saw her, he ordered, she came to the... It's David acting like God and abusing his power. And gosh, how frank the Bible is. Then to cover it up, murder. David, this is David. This is not some low life we're talking about. This is the great King David. And yet the Bible is so clear-eyed. Furthermore, as Nathan told him, the sword will never leave your house. So the Lord forgave him, but the baby died, and the sword will never leave your house, which it never did. Read the rest of 2 Samuel. And it's the sword never leaving his house. Or the other one that really strikes me, Eli and his sons, I think is the best analogy. Remember back in 1 Samuel? So Eli, high priest, 2 sons, both priests, they're abusing the people, sexually and financially. The people complain to Eli, hey, your sons, I'll talk to them. He talks to them, they don't care, they keep abusing the people. And I remember saying to Catholic audiences, does any of this story sound familiar to you? There's priests abusing their own people. Complaints are brought to the high priest, who should do something about it. He pays it lip service, but doesn't do anything. And then what happens? Disaster for Israel, right? That's when the Philistines come and they kill 30,000, and the Ark of the Covenant is taken away. I mean, so the very spiritual heart of the people is ripped out. And then I say to my Catholic people, does any of that sound familiar? That we were handed over to our enemies. And the church went through this time of enormous chastisement. Well, yeah, the Bible told us that story a long time ago, and it's playing out again. So I've urged, now we're getting in the weeds a little bit, but we turn so much to the psychologists and the lawyers, and there's something to that. I'm not bad-mouthing psychologists and lawyers. We had to. But we should turn above all to the Bible. The Bible is our great matrix of understanding, and it gives us the clearest understanding of these things.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for going there, as it were. I want to ask a question about the nuns. Not the nuns, but the nuns. The non-affiliated, not the people who wear the recognizable clothing. You've, in an essay entitled Looking for the Nuns, again, not the nuns, but the nuns, you suggested that nuns, I found this fascinating, that nuns tend to romanticize the quest for truth.
Oh, yeah.
But in such a way that, to borrow from U2, U2 was my Bob Dylan for you, U2 for me.
I love U2, yeah.
They romanticize the quest for truth, but in such a way that they never find what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, one of my intellectual heroes is Bernard Lonergan, who was a Jesuit mathematician, scientist, and philosopher of the last century. One of the really masterminds, I think, of the last century. And Lonergan did an analysis of how we come to know. He was very influenced by Newman, by the way. And there are 4 stages, Lonergan said, to coming to know. The first stage is attention. So you want to know something, you got to open your darn eyes, and you have to look, and you have to be attentive to what's going on. And there are a million reasons why we're not attentive. I don't want to see it, I'm too lazy, don't have time, I'm affected by prejudice. So the first thing is to overcome all that and really see what's there, right? The second stage, Lonergan said, is intelligence. And intelligence means form hypotheses. So you've taken in a phenomenon, you've seen something. Now, what is that? What's going on? How do you explain that? What's the form of that? So a scientist would form hypotheses. A philosopher begins musing about it, right? That's the level of intelligence. At that level, it's appropriate to be kind of really open-minded and really keep looking. And it could be this, could be that, maybe this. Maybe you're right, maybe I'm right, maybe she's right. That's appropriate at the second level. But then Lonergan says, if you want to make real progress, you got to move to a third level, which is the level of judgment. And notice how the quiet went over the room, because we hate the word judgment. But judgment just means you make a decision. You say, okay, I've observed the phenomenon. I've now entertained lots of really bright ideas of what this thing might be. But now I got to decide which one is the right, and not just the bright idea, what's the right idea? Now, why is that unattractive? Because the word decision is from a Latin word, caesare, which means to cut, like scissors, right? To cut, because you're cutting off. It's not this, not that, not this, not that, it's that. And so judgment is painful, necessarily. It's bloody, judgment. But you've got to do it if you're actually going to move to truth and not just having wild ideas. Now, to answer your question, I think a lot of people get stuck at level 2. Is they say, oh, yeah, it could be this, and you got a good point, and you got a good point, and yeah, and I'm not going to judge you, and don't you judge me, and let's all just kind of tolerate all these wild points of view. Well, fine, but then we're not moving toward truth. We're not actually moving toward truth. It's painful to make a judgment. And so people get stuck at level 2, and they romanticize it. And that's why you get, oh, it's the quest that matters. Oh, it's to just keep raising questions. But Chesterton, one of my heroes, said, the open mind is like an open mouth. It's meant to close down on something nourishing. So it's like your mouth is open all the time. You throw food, it falls out. See, but that's stage 2. It's like, okay, I'm testing. It could be this, could be that. Do I like this? I don't know. If your mouth is open all the time, you're not going to eat anything. So I got an open mind. Well, I mean, good for you. But if your mind is just open, then things will just keep falling out of it. Is what it's meant to do is make a judgment and close down on something where you say, this is right. And then, by the way, the 4th step for Lonergan is responsibility. Now that you've made that decision, live with it. And
so it could be that we want to stay in level 2 because we're actually afraid of level 4 as much as level 3.
Yeah, quite right.
I don't want to have to live with something that might call me to.
Quite right. And so, sure, let's stay open. And that's why the whole culture of non-judgmentalism. Well, yes, I get it. Judge not, you'll not be judged, and all that there's an aggressive form of that. But it can't mean that we never decide, or we never make a judgment, or we never come to truth. It can't mean that. But I think that the society has sort of valorized.
And it's striking how anti-scientific that is, isn't it, too?
Yeah,
'Cause
sure.
there's no hypothesis. And I think about in my own learning, when I've had the courage to venture a provisional conclusion, and it's been challenged, I've learned so much further.
Yeah.
And when I'm not making a decision, it becomes a cul-de-sac. So I'm actually not questing anymore at all. I'm just stuck in this little...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but see, again, Lonergan is very good here because he was a Jesuit, and the Jesuits are into this tradition of the spiritual exercises, right? And how do you get rid of your attachments so as to follow the will of God? Well, see, Lonergan applied that to the life of the mind. What are the attachments that I have that are keeping me from being attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible? And you've just named some of them.
That's great.
That there are a lot of things that block our access to those four moves. And so we got to deal with that stuff if we're going to really come to truth.
That's great. I want to ask you about beige Catholicism.
Oh, yeah.
It's something you've talked about. What is it? Why have people opted for beige forms of Christianity? And what's the problem with it?
Yeah, it was one of the very first articles I ever wrote. I just got back from my doctoral studies, and I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to get into the game, to write articles and books. And one of the first ones I wrote was a critique of what I called beige. And to tell you the truth, I was thinking of my home parish in Western Springs, Illinois. It was built during the 1970s. And so look, I'm a devotee of like the Gothic cathedrals. I love light and color and narrativity and symbolism and all that in the churches. But the churches built in the 70s, when I was coming of age, were just kind of big empty rooms with high brick walls, no decoration, nothing that would stir the imagination. That was seen as kind of distracting from the central action of the liturgy and all this. I've never gone for that. I never liked it, never thought it was right. And that church was literally beige, right? All the distinctive coloration, it kind of bled into one bland beige. So I used that as a symbol of the liberal Catholicism that was regnant when I was a young guy, where we allowed a lot of our Catholic life, I think, to lose its color and its vivacity and its narrativity and its distinctiveness. We were so concerned about fitting in with the wider culture or not offending anybody that we became a vague echo of the culture. And so the beige church, the church building, became for me a symbol of a beige presentation of Catholicism. And I've long been convinced, and I'm convinced to this day, it's anti-evangelical. That it does, if the church is just, in the case of the buildings, literally blending into the neighborhood, there's nothing distinctive about it. If our ideas and rhetoric just sound like anything you'd hear on Oprah, well then what's the point, right? What's the point? If, you hear an Easter homily and it's all about politics or something, well, then what's the point? I can get politics on, I can watch, the Sunday morning talk shows and get politics. Whether it's left or right, I don't care at this point. But if your Easter homily isn't about Jesus Christ risen from the dead, then I don't know what we're wasting our time with. Yeah. So that's what I mean by beige Catholicism. It was my term, in a way, for the liberal Catholicism that I had grown up with.
And it's nice, too, because it both sort of militates against a dumbed-down presentation of the gospel. Yeah. It's doctrinally rich. It's not afraid of big categories. But it also pushes hard against an ugly, kind of drab presentation as well.
Well, at dinner we were talking about this. I loved this wonderful dinner with a number of faculty here, and actually I love theology, and they're all theologians and philosophers, so we talked about that. But a name that came up was Karl Barth, and I don't know if you guys read much of Karl Barth here. I found that Barth in Protestant circles, when I first started years ago, I'd say, wait, no, Karl Barth says, thinking I'd get a huge positive response, and
he's worse than the Pope.
Karl Barth, So anyway, but Karl Barth was battling a form of Protestant liberalism in his time that has its roots back in the 19th century. And what he wanted to do, it seems to me, was recover this wonderful, strange jungle of the Bible. That the Bible is this world that opens up to us in all of its splendor, and it's not like the environing culture. It's not what everyone else is saying. It's this odd word of God with these strange figures and characters. And he wanted to de-domesticate the Bible. You know what I'm saying? is liberalism in both its Protestant and Catholic forms is a kind of domestication of the gospel. And so I always stood with Barth. I always thought he was right about that. And his friend and colleague, who became a great inspiration to me, was the Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, who made a very similar move within Catholicism to get us back into the jungle of the Bible and this thickly textured biblical world. Do you know what I'm saying? That's non-beige. That's the non-beige. And a lot of my work, so I wrote a little book years ago called The Strangest Way. And I wanted to say, I begin by talking about the crucified Jesus. And in our culture, we're so used to seeing the cross. But come on, everybody. The cross, I mean, is this horrible instrument of torture that was meant to terrify the whole world. And they didn't talk about it for centuries, even after the rise of Christianity, because it was so gross and offensive. Do you know where the very first depiction is? I've seen it. It's in Rome on the wooden door at Santa Sabina in Rome. It's a little tiny thing this big. And it's a little image of these three figures on the cross. Because they just didn't, it was too much. It was too gross. Good. Bring it back. Let's Paul say, I pledge to know one thing among you, Christ and him crucified. Right, because Paul knew it horrified his audiences. But he wanted that thick texture of the cross, because that is where the power was. So he gave us a totally non-beige Christianity, and I think we needed to recover that.
That's great.
So I'm pontificating.
I might want to come back to that in a second too, but to switch gears for a second, in his novel The Idiot, Dostoevsky has this line where he says that beauty will save the world. Is he right?
Yes. No, I believe in that very strongly. The three transcendentals, right? The good, the true, and the beautiful, which kind of echo up and down Western civilization. Wherever you find being, that's why they're transcendental. Wherever you find being, you're going to find actually unity as well. Unity, goodness, truth, and beauty. And we could talk about all of those. But I've been persuaded recently, Balthasar had a big role in changing my mind here, because he puts beauty in the first place. But there's a contemporary Catholic philosopher called D.C. Schindler, who writes at a beautiful and very high level. But he said he thinks that of the transcendentals, the first one is beauty. Now, why? Well, truth is being in the measure that it beguiles the mind. So think of intelligibility, right? So the scientist is beguiled by the intelligibility of the world. That's the true. The good, well, that's the will, is awakened by goodness within the realm of being. Okay. But Schindler says, before you get there, those are relatively derivative. Before you get there, the first thing that strikes you is the splendor of being. And there it is. The beautiful, the splendor of things first gets our attention. So Balthasar says it's the smile of the mother. It's a beautiful image. Think of a little baby looking up in the smiling face of his mother. Well, the baby isn't thinking about truth or goodness. The baby's thinking about beauty, right? It's the splendor of the mother's smile that awakens the baby to being, right? I think that's right. And then I'm going to apply it more practically. Today, in our postmodern culture, what do people hate? Being told what to think. Who are you to tell me what to think? I got my own truth, you got your own truth, right? So truth raises the hackles. If there's something even more objectionable, it's the good. Who are you to tell me how to behave? Don't tell me how to behave. I tell myself how to behave. So the good tends to turn people off. But the beautiful, it's not as threatening, right? Hey, look. Like even coming in here, you know, how striking this is. And when I walked in that door, I was like, wow, look. I'm not telling you what to think or how to behave yet. We'll get there. See, but,
he is a bishop.
Right, but that's how it works. See, because the transcendentals are related to each other. So it has to work that way. But the beautiful first gets our attention. You know where the word beautiful, it's interesting to me, is used very frequently is in regard to sports. Think of when you're watching a golf or football or baseball or whatever, how often the commentators say something like, hey, beautiful catch. That was a beautiful curveball. What a beautiful fast break. Look at that beautiful swing, right? Well, that's right. See, you're first struck by the beautiful, and then you want to play, right? If you've really watched beautiful athletes, and think of the Greeks here, that sports were an expression of the beautiful. Before they were competitive and all that, they were an expression of the beautiful. You watch a beautiful fast break, I'd like to try that. I can't now, but when I was younger, let me try that. Or I watch, Rory McIlroy swing a golf club. Like, wow, let me get out and try. I know I'll never be that good, but let me try. And then from the beautiful to the good, and then finally you say, oh yeah, now I kind of understand how the swing works. That's why it's beautiful. That's what he puts together, elbow and the shoulder turn so I've gone now from the beautiful to the good, like, hey, it's splendid. And then I want to try. And then, oh yeah, now I understand. And I think that's how it works with the gospel too, is the splendor.
Yeah, would you walk us through that? What would it look like to be evangelistic, beginning with
Show
beauty?
them Jesus. Talk about Jesus. Tell the stories of Jesus. Put the cross, what does Paul say? The cross was displayed before you. Christ was displayed as crucified before you. Now, from my Catholic background, the saints. Begin with the saints. Look, Mother Teresa. When I did this thing, a 10-part series called Catholicism, and I went all over the world to do it. And I'd never been to India before, and we got to Calcutta, which is one of the poorest cities in the world, right? And it's horrifying in a way to be in Calcutta. And then we go right to the worst section of Calcutta, and that's where Mother Teresa's nuns are. And these mostly young women in those beautiful blue and white habits. And there they were, I saw this, pulling maggots out of people's ears and stuff. And with these radiant smiles. I don't know, your life changes when you see that. What you're seeing is beautiful. How beautiful that is. Look at the beauty of that, And then the saints have that effect on you. I want to try that. I should live more like that. And then maybe in time, I'll understand, oh yeah, those are the dynamics of this life. I come to understand it. So show them Jesus. Show them the great biblical patterns. Show them the saints who are exemplifications even now of the biblical patterns. And then draw them in that way,
I love the example of Mother Teresa, because I was wondering earlier when you were talking about the offense of the cross. One thing you could say is, wait, it could be that the cross is just not beautiful at all.
Yeah.
So there's a tension there, but I love how you come back with Mother Teresa and can speak of the clearly, maybe we call it a moral beauty, but the deep spiritual beauty of
right, because it's a very interesting thing in the history of the Catholic-Protestant debate, because Luther was uneasy with that language, of glory, and didn't like a theology of glory. How interesting that von Balthasar writes 7 volumes called Herrlichkeit in German, which means the glory, right? So Balthasar, who is a great friend of Barth, had deep appreciation for Luther, but said, no, I'm going to give you 8 volumes of glory. And he actually played on that idea of the cross, that yes, in the conventional sense, how horrific and ugly the cross is. But what do you see on the cross? Aquinas says the beautiful occurs at the intersection of integritas, consonantia, and claritas, meaning I'd say wholeness, harmony, and radiance. What you see, Balthasar said, in the whole life of Jesus is the great concordance or harmony between the divine and human wills, between his divine and human natures. Where does it come to full expression? In the obedience of the Son on the cross. And so you see in the integrity, the wholeness, the unity of his life, the coming together of the natures. And what is that? Well, it becomes splendid. It becomes radiant. It has claritas, And didn't he himself say, I'm the light of the world. I'm the light. I'm the source of the splendor of the world. The transfiguration, which shows his splendor, but what's he talking about? But his transition, his exodus, his passion. So the cross, yes, is ugly in the conventional sense, but if you see with the eyes of faith, it's a supreme expression of the beautiful. It's the glory of the Lord revealed,
Well, and often when you talk about about the evangelistic role of beauty, you talk about its arresting character anyways. And so that strikes me that that's another way that the cross in its very horror can play a similar role. It can arrest a person.
I got that from Balthazar too. We talk about aesthetic arrest. It's a cool idea, isn't it? That the truly beautiful stops you in your tracks. Yeah. And think of we're leading our ordinary lives. We're making our way and we're moving. But then the beautiful breaks through and it stops you. It stops you from doing what you're doing or thinking what you're thinking. It stops you, and then Balthazar says it sends you on mission. So once you've taken it in, then you say, I want to share that with other people. I want them to know what I've come to know. And so he would say the beauty of Christ, and this is it's the resurrection here, really, isn't it? The beauty of Christ, the splendor of the Lord, stops us in our tracks and then sends us on mission, so we become evangelizers of it. Remember, if you were a student of literature, the great James Joyce, who's a deeply ambiguous figure, Catholic, of course, Irish Catholic, deeply imbued with the Catholic spirit, left the church, hated the church, but remained, I think, Catholic in spirit. But what does he say at the end of his Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, his great autobiographical novel, is, I shall become a reporter of epiphanies. So he had an epiphany, a manifestation of the divine. And now my job as a writer is to report epiphanies. That's pretty good. See, because remember in the book, his alter ego wants to be a priest, Stephen Dedalus, and then decides, no, I'm not going to be a priest. But he became a kind of priest. Because as a novelist, as a poet, he became a reporter of epiphanies. Evangelists do something similar, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, there's so many more questions I want to ask you about that. It strikes me that you said that Catholicism, the documentary series, might be your life's work. You could happily die and point to that as a legacy. How does that exemplify this leading with beauty?
Well, that was very much in our minds when we made that series. I was inspired, maybe some are old enough in the room to remember Kenneth Clark's Civilization. Remember that show? Kenneth Clark was a great English art historian, director of the not the British Museum, but the National Gallery in London. Did this show back in the 1970s when I was a kid. And he went all over the Western world and he showed the great works of art, the paintings and sculpture and buildings and so on. And it just captivated me. I love that show. And he was this kind of quirky English eccentric guy, brilliant, little tweed suit, and he's clambering over rocks to show you things. But I just loved that show. And so when I, started this ministry, and one of my board members said, hey, Father, if you're dreaming big, what would you dream about? And I said, a Catholic version of civilization. So I laid that out, that I'd go, like Kenneth Clark, all over the Catholic world, and I would show the great monuments of Catholicism, the beauty of it, as I talk about the truth of it. And they said, well, why can't you do that? And I said, well, I need to get permission, first of all, from my bishop, and then secondly, I need about, $6 million. And so, make a long story short, we ended up eventually getting both those things, and we did it. And we did that series. And it was very much in my mind that I'm going to lead with beauty. We're going to show the beauty of the faith as I talk about it. I was against dumbed down Catholicism, and I was against a beautified Catholicism. And I wanted both those to come to the fore.
Who's the most beautiful saint?
Most beautiful saint? Well, my great hero is Thomas Aquinas. And there's a lot about Thomas that would correspond to the beautiful. My motto, when you become a bishop, you have to choose a motto. And I chose Aquinas, the story about toward the end of his life when he had written, in his great Summa Theologiae, in the last part he's writing on the sacraments. And he's just finished the treatise on the Eucharist, which is one of the great statements of Catholic theology. If you want to try to understand what we mean by the real presence, read John 6, but then read Thomas Aquinas in the third part of the Summa. He put, according to the story, very dramatically, he put the text at the foot of the cross as if to ask judgment on it, because he didn't know if he had done justice to the sacrament. And the story is that the voice came from the cross and said, Bene scripticite me toma. So Jesus spoke Latin to him, of course. You've written well of me, Thomas. What would you have as a reward? And he said, non nisi te domine, which means I'll have nothing except you, Lord, which is such a great answer because, and that's what I took as my motto. I took non nisi te domine because it's just that it's summing up your life. What do you want, right? What do you want? Oh, I want pleasure. I want power. I want money. I want honor. I want, a big career. I want, who cares? I mean, those are all fine things, but only if what you really want is the Lord. And then he'll show you how to use those things, right? But if you say, what I want is I want pleasure and power, and then your life will be a mess. And welcome to the sinful world that we all inhabit, right? Because we seek all those things. So that's what I find beautiful in Aquinas, is that move, the non nisi te domine.
That's lovely. We're running out of time, so can we do a speed round?
Yeah, sure.
Questions. What's one thing you wish evangelical Protestants knew about Catholics? Really knew?
How biblical the Mass is.
Great.
Yeah, let me say this real quickly. Thank God, the evangelicals have helped us so much. I say this very humbly as a Catholic. Though, obviously the Bible's always been part of our life, but thank God for evangelicals for bringing so to the fore the Bible. And ever since Vatican II, it's been a huge emphasis within Catholicism. We haven't done it that well, to be honest with you, but we have the resolve to be biblical. And then I think the evangelical focus to really proclaim the Lord Jesus and to do it in a not ashamed, do it with panache and with confidence. We got a lot of that from the evangelical world, thank God. Yeah. But I guess so the one thing I want is that evangelicals realize that the most distinctive Catholic thing, the Mass, is entirely biblical. From the sign of the cross to the greeting, which comes from Paul, the Kyrie, right, which comes from the Bartimaeus story. The first reading comes from the Old Testament, the Psalm from the Psalms, the second reading from the New Testament, the Gospel. The Creed is some summary of history of salvation. You have the Barakah prayer from the Old Testament. You've got the institution narrative from the Synoptic Gospels. You've got the Our Father. You've got the Lamb of God from some John the Baptist. I've just walked through the whole ritual of the Mass. And there's something beautifully, austerely biblical about the Mass. So that's what it would be.
That's great. And then another speed round. Can you name one, maybe two things that we as evangelical Protestants steps we can take to help evangelize our city here, Los Angeles, this region?
As I said earlier, first be kind to each other. How these Christians love one another, it's very important. Secondly, I'd say, and you're good at this, let the language of the faith be on your lips naturally. Don't hide it. We Catholics are bad at that. We tend to hide it, and we want to whisper it among ourselves, or it's like our little private hobby. Let it be on your lips naturally. Let people see the joy you have. And then also I'd say, following St. Peter, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's in you. Is read up. We got challenges out there in the culture. The people that don't like us think that we're stupid and superstitious. Be able to answer their questions. And those are all things we can do.
That's great. So finally, just in a minute or two, I suspect that many young evangelicals are shy about the work of evangelism. Yeah. And I can think of a bunch of reasons. Maybe it's because all the evangelical church scandals. Maybe it's a response to an arrogant argument culture and a reluctance to wade into treacherous waters. Maybe it's a lack of confidence in the solidity of the Christian faith. Maybe it's simply a failure of nerve. But I wonder if you could just, in a minute or two, cast a vision for us of the beauty of evangelism and the part that an average layperson can play in it.
Oh, that's the question, isn't it? The beauty of it is declaring the lordship of Jesus. Go right back to Paul, right? Jesus Kyrios. That's what Paul says. That's why I end up in prison a lot, right? Because what people said at the time was Kaiser Kyrios, Caesar's the Lord. And so when Paul started saying, no, Jesus Kyrios, that was deeply subversive, and it was meant to be subversive. I think in the beginning of Mark's gospel, when I've got euangelion for you, Well, Evangelion was the good news of an imperial victory. When the emperor general won a battle, I'd send Evangelion, and Mark is saying, no, it's not about that. I got good news. It's about Jesus, not Caesar. In fact, someone that Caesar put to death. And just to rub it in, I'm going to call him Weos Tuteu. I'm going to call him the Son of God. Well, that was Caesar's title, right, from the time of Julius Caesar, and then his